Hello and see ya. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest. Normally we hold conferences, lectures, seminars, but because of the coronavirus epidemic, obviously we're in lockdown like everybody else. But we're trying to get around that by meeting some of the people who we think are able to illuminate our present situation and some of the wider reasons why we're in this situation through podcasts. This is the first one, and I'm happy to say that my guest is an old friend and a distinguished one. He is Alberto Mingardi. He's the executive director of the Istituto Bruno Leoni in Milan. And Milan, of course, is more or less at the center of the region which has suffered worse than any other region in Italy from the pandemic. So, first of all, welcome, Alberto. I hope you're feeling well. We were discussing that a moment ago. But obviously, everybody is a bit worried at the moment. And I'd just like to begin with a couple of general questions about the situation in Italy. How bad is it still? Is it getting better? The latest figures I've seen are that something like 18,000 people have now died and that 140,000 have become infected. They're very high figures. And obviously Italy has been in kind of agony lately. Can you just give me first a personal view on what the situation is? Is it working? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And are government measures beginning to have the right effect?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate your time, and I'm very glad that we can, go on with the kind of activities you and I used to entertain under lockdown by, resorting to all of these new technologies. On the one hand, it seems that is going better. I mean, for the last few days, the most important thing, and actually one of the surest, so to say, measures that we do have, which is the number of people entering emergency care units, has been slightly declining in Lombardy and throughout the country. At the very same time, I think we do not have, at least at the moment, very good data. Every day at 6 o'clock at night, the government is providing us with information on the cases on a day-by-day basis. But when it comes to the deaths, for example, it is quite clear by now that deaths are underestimated because, they basically are about people dying in hospitals, but particularly in some areas, and particularly near Bergamo, which is, roughly speaking, 60 kilometers from Milan. Lots of people died in their houses. So for that area, some people speculate that actually we may be talking about as many as 5 times the official numbers only for that area. So in the last 3-4 days, overall Italian numbers seem to be, so to say, on the good path. But when it comes to the soundness of data, we're still dealing with a big question mark.
One of the aspects of that uncertainty, of course, is the fact that the differences between Germany and Italy are so great. They are the starkest. There are differences between Italy and most other countries, but certainly the Italian figures are rather similar to Spain. But generally speaking, Germany has been one outlier, the smallest number of deaths, and until recently, Italy the largest. Do you have any sense of what underlies that difference?
Well, a number of things. First of all is preparations. It is by now clear that actually Germans were preparing very well for an emergency such as this. Another point which is very important is the number of beds in emergency care units. hospitals in Germany are, generally speaking, better equipped for a situation like the one we're going through. And I'm afraid to say another thing, which apparently is substantially different between Germany and Italy, is the average age of people sick with COVID-19. This is something that once more, points into a direction of better preparations and better interventions on the part of the German government. Clearly, it's not easy, to use an euphemism, to deal with this situation. The Italian government made plenty of mistakes. Some of these mistakes were very difficult to avoid because were mistakes basically due to the fact that we were, and we are still by and large, ignorant about the nature of this virus, which is a new virus. But to me, it is by now quite clear that one of the major mistakes we made was beginning with closing schools down. And when when the Italian government closed the school, shut the school down, it was said to people that, it's fine if you leave your kids home with their grandparents. And that's a very dangerous combination with COVID-19 because for what we know now, young people tend to have very mild symptoms or be asymptomatic, whereas the disease is extremely serious for older people. So on the one hand, we closed down school as the first measure, and we suggested that people can leave, grandparents and grandsons together. And then, of course, when we lock people down, we are basically forcing them to stay with their families. Now, the Italian demography is what it is, but in addition to the Italian demography, to the fact that Italy is a very old country, there is also the fact that a huge number of Italian young people tend to live with their older parents. And so I think that by now, there are a lot of sensible speculation about the possibility of, a good chunk of the contagion basically happened within families. So I think the German government was clearly better prepared. Also, the way in which German hospitals are structured helped them. But also it's a problem of demography. On that front, we are not so different, but also of the way in which society and families are structured.
That's very interesting because the point you made about the closing of the schools is exactly the same point that was made in advance by those scientists in Britain and elsewhere who said that lockdown would be a bad thing, that mitigation was the better strategy, and that would mean, for example, not closing schools for the reasons you just gave. Now, another element in that criticism was that lockdown would not work. That is to say, it would gradually break down. People would get bored, irritated. They would not, in the end, keep to the rules. I don't see that's happening a lot, but I see one or two signs of it in other countries. Do you have any view on in a sense, what you've just said applies to the choice of strategies, mitigation or repression, lockdown?
Well, I'm no biologist, so what I can say is that I find it quite bizarre, and clearly I think that indicates that societies such as ours should better prepare for this kind of event. The fact that basically we are dealing with an epidemic in the pretty much the same way that our ancestors did in the 15th century. So if you look at it from the point of view of collective choices, it didn't change much. I mean, you basically lock people down in their flats and houses, and that's it. And you wait. That is perhaps the only thing that you can really do when you're hit by the wave. But at the very same time, it is quite depressing, given the fact that in the 15th and 17th and 16th centuries, people had no ideas that virus existed at all. So there is some sort of a gap, it seems to me, between the bulk of scientific knowledge we do have on one end and the strategies that we are putting in place. Now, we all hope this is temporary. I think that you mentioned the possibility of this sort of policy breaking down. Italians have been, contrary to any stereotypes, remarkably responsible and remarkably obedient so far. And let me clarify something. It is true that you're fined if you are outside of your flat and you're just roaming around. So that's a risk you're running into. But at the very same time, as anybody with some sort of administrative experience can easily tell you, it is impossible to lock 60 million people down. So if they're staying in their houses and flats, most of them is because they are convinced this is a huge problem, this is an emergency, and everybody needs to do their own fair share in trying to cope with this. But having said that, there are clearly costs with lockdowns. The economic cost is apparent, is evident. We are getting into an economic crisis which did not generate in the market, but it's a crisis that is basically the product of the fact that governments told economic activities to terminate or freeze. But we do have also psychological costs. Not everybody has a nice flat. Lots of people need to stay home in very uncomfortable conditions. And I think there are also costs in the longer run for healthcare, because clearly, you eat a lot, you do not do enough physical activity, you don't stay in the sun enough. So all of this may be a bounce back if we continue to prolong the lockdown. Basically, it is, I think, by now quite clear that the Italian lockdown will go on until early May, and the schools and universities will not open for this semester. And there are actually discussions about keeping them closed in September as well. So the impact is clearly going to be profound.
Now, I want to come back later to the questions of healthcare and how the healthcare systems will come out of this, but you've raised some of the economic points already. Let me just ask a few questions on that score. For example, the Italian economy was not in very good shape, I think, was it, prior to the epidemic outbreak?
It was not. So Italy is a very frail patient, economically speaking, because it had plenty of existing conditions. The economy was very weak, basically heading for zero growth. The debt to GDP ratio was very high, 135% of GDP. Well, one thing that should be mentioned is that clearly the government, whatever its virtues in terms of being quite prompt and ready in responding to the epidemic, at the very same time, is made of parties and people who share a very top-down, dirigist view of the economy. So the situation of the Italian economy wasn't particularly good at the beginning of the year. Now, at the very beginning of the epidemic, there were, quite modest estimate of Italy suffering a -1, -3% in GDP growth. By now, all the estimates are above -10% in GDP growth. That means 10% negative growth this year.
Well, now, you mentioned that Italy, it was composed of the Italian government was composed of parties that by and large are not in favour of free market and classical liberal principles. I think it's true to say that at the moment, even parties that are committed in theory to those principles in other countries and their governments are in fact imposing solutions that really increase state control and take risks fiscally and financially, and are certainly not making, while they're dealing directly with the effects of the epidemic, they're laying up economic trouble for the future. Do you think we're going to be able to row back from those kind of policies after the epidemic has petered out?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had an answer. -10% in GDP growth is exactly equal for Italy to the effect of World War II. In 1945, the Italian GDP was 10% less than in 1939. My view is that it is one thing to take emergency measures these days, and in a sense, a state is some kind of an insurance policy, and this is exactly the moment where you need an insurance policy. But the problem is that, of course, there are going to be, power grabs. For example, and we see some of those in Italy. There's going to be temptation to nationalize big time. There's going to be a lot of pork, so to say, in all of these emergency plans. And the biggest problem is that all of these will make recovery slower and longer. So on the one hand, we are really a paradoxical situation. We need clearly to restrain some freedoms to cope with the virus in the short run. But if we need to, so to say, survive the economic epidemic, which locking peoples and economies down is causing, so this is a crisis which is totally of the making of the state, and it's a crisis which is made on purpose, so to say. Then we will need far more economic liberty at the end of this process than we currently enjoy now. That is particularly true in countries like Italy, where the intricacies of the bureaucracy are legendary. But I think the same is, generally speaking, true throughout the Western world. In a sense, I think not so much about China, but of countries like Taiwan and South Korea. They are emerging out of this crisis as new model in governance. States that are not particularly expensive. South Korea has 20% of GDP that goes into public spending and a very small public debt. But nonetheless, these are small states, but extremely effective ones.
Let me ask a question on the first part of those remarks, and I'll come to the second later. You said that, to my surprise, that it looks as though when this is over, that the Italian GDP will have fallen by the same amount as it did in 44-45. The Germans, of course, were hit even more badly in 1945, 6 and 7. I think they still call 1947 year zero. And so I wonder if we can look back at those times and ask you the question, What was the best way found then? How did people get up from that slough of despond and revive their economies again? Because when you think about it, Western European economies recovered reasonably quickly after the Second World War.
Well, it recovered very quickly indeed. I mean, in the, I think it was 1949, GDP per capita in Italy was already at the same level of pre-war years. And in the early 50s, it was above first pre-war years with a population of 2 million people more. What happened then, and on this, actually, Italy and Germany are very similar, clearly Western Germany at the time. What happened was that basically governments led by Alcide De Gasperi in Italy and by Konrad Adenauer in Germany chose a version of benign neglect. So they focused very much on restoring a degree of law and order. They focused very much, at the time, not only the Germans, but the Italians as well, in providing people with sound money. But also they allowed entrepreneurial activity to flourish, particularly in a context in which markets were opening up again. So companies could start exporting, and of course then it comes the birth of the European Common Market later on that pretty much propped this process up. But at the time, I think benign neglect was something that, up to a certain extent, was shared as a policy, even by people in the statist, in the socialist opposition. Very briefly, in 1946, the Treasury Minister was a classical liberal, Epicharmo Corbino, and he once said that he had absolutely no idea of how many salaries the government was paying. So the collapse somehow of the state machinery made it impossible to pursue seriously any vision of planning. So they were not necessarily ideologically liberal, but it was pretty much the only thing they could do at the time, given the collapse of state machineries, as I said, but also given the fact that the end of fascism and National Socialism basically convinced people of a number of things, and one of the things was that autarky had been a very dangerous and self-defeating policy. The problem we have this time, of course, is that the lesson that political classes will learn out of this may be very, very different.
Well, I think you're saying that some of the things you're recommending will not always likely to happen. I'm going to focus on one rather narrow question there. During the Brexit debate in Britain, the accusation was made, and I stress it was an accusation, that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives wanted to create what people called, their opponents called, Singapore upon the Thames. In view of what you just said about Singapore and Taiwan, would that not be the best way out of this? Well, I've used the phrase slough of despond from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Wouldn't a Singapore on Thames be the best way out of that situation?
Well, I'm easily with you on that. I think, particularly when you consider a country like Italy, you do have a tremendous entrepreneurial capital. The only reason why Italy is afloat, in spite of too many years of terrible policies, is the fact that, particularly in the north of the country, you got lots of fantastic small businesses and great entrepreneurial minds. Now, one of the problems within this crisis, clearly, is that COVID-19, which in many ways it's a virus of the elite. I mean, it's a virus that clearly is particularly dangerous for people moving around, traveling a lot, having lots of contacts. That's one of the reasons why so many people in government all throughout the West got it, I mean, including Boris Johnson. So COVID-19 hit the north of the country so strong, and this, of course, economically speaking, it's making far more damage, because even if Italy goes back, as I hope, to some sort of precarious normality, so to say, sometimes in May, it will start from regions in the south whose economic contribution to the Italian GDP is far smaller. If you consider Lombardy, which is the region of Milan, and Veneto, which is the region of Venice, the two of them together provide basically 35% of the Italian GDP. So it's so concentrated. And the only way, I mean, lots of these people, lots of these businessmen are going to be encountering tremendous problems in reopening. And I suppose that for quite a few of them, the possibility of, closing down
Somebody's
forever,
ringing on this.
And thinking about, retiring in their villa in Côte d'Azur would be a real option. So you need to do something to convince these people not to give up, not to retire, try once more in their life to adapt and challenge the fortune, so to say. And the only way in which I see you can do that is scrapping red tape big time.
Let me now raise the question, therefore, of as part of looking forward to the recovery, let me ask you the question, what about the role of Europe? My impression from reading is that the Italian people feel at the moment rather let down by the EU. Is that justified? And what kind of policies are you hoping, and is the Italian government hoping the EU will now pursue? Because in one sense, at least, we're all in this together.
Well, I think that the Italian government has been unreasonable, and basically the Italian government position is that we need to use this crisis to mutualize debt. Why does Italy want to mutualize debt? Clearly, as I said before, Italy is financially crippled. And so it needs to keep interest rates down as much as possible in order to avoid spending too much in servicing its own debt. This last Eurogroup meeting somehow contrived some sort of solution, and any of these solutions really need to go through the European it's called Financial Stability Mechanism. The name has changed recently, but these basically European IMF, if you want to call it that way, which was there, theoretically speaking, to intervene in conditions of fiscal crisis, but it is actually the instrument which is more easily adapted to intervene in a situation such as this. It is clear that this solution is opposed by two countries. On the one hand, the Netherlands. The Netherlands have a very low debt to GDP ratio, and therefore their point is, understandably, we're not committing to any solution until we get some reassurance from Italians and Spaniards and French on the way in which they're going to be spending this money, and the Italians. So the two extremes in the debate are Italy and the Netherlands. It's now France, Germany, but also Spain in between. My reaction to all of it is that I think we are focusing by and large on wrong solutions for a problem which is still in the making. I say wrong solution because this idea of Eurobonds, which has been around for quite a few years, will require a substantial amount of time to be engineered financially. So if tomorrow morning or tonight an agreement is reached and we're going to be having Eurobonds, well, what happens is it's going to be taking us 1 year, 1.5 years until these reach the debt market. So if the problem of Italy and Spain is having something now, this is clearly not the right instrument. At the very same time, I think it's impossible to have Eurobonds on the one hand without some sort of common fiscal policy for understandable reasons. I mean, if you are issuing debt together, then you're taking a joint commitment and you need more fiscal coordination at the European level. Now, even though I think that that will be good for Italy, I do not approve of it, ideologically speaking. I think having fiscal competition is better for Europe as a whole. But the biggest problem to me is the fact that we are wasting lots of time in basically having this macro debate with governments confronting each other on how big their stimulus packages are. And we are not considering the true problem, which is the following. To get out of this, we will need a massive reallocation of resources. It is by now clear that whatever happens in the next 2-3 months, we are not going to go to restaurants like we used to do. We are not going to go to theaters like we used to do. The economy needs to change because we're going to be living with the virus for at least 2 years more. So, you know, lots of Italian very small businesses are small bars, places where in the morning people are having breakfast with their coffee and their croissant standing 5 centimeters one from the other. This cannot go on for the time being. So we need to move resources from places where they're going to be wasted to places in the economy where they can be profitably used. We need less shopping malls and more e-commerce. We need less waiters and more people doing delivery of stuff. We need to do lots of things like this in the realm of the economy. And that requires, if we want this to happen swiftly and quick, major deregulation. So we're spending too much time talking about basically money that will be channeled through the banking sector in order to keep businesses afloat. But we are not spending enough time in debating how we can make the life of these businesses viable again.
You know, I completely agree with that. And what I've noticed here in Budapest is it's already happening. Obviously, most restaurants now are closed. Some restaurants are closed completely. Others, you can't eat in them. But there are now services to deliver food which have grown enormously. And one of the things you notice about the city is, although there are many fewer people around, there are a lot of people riding bikes, carrying hot food from the restaurant to the home. So, but the question now would be, if reallocation of resources in the private sector is desirable and is to some degree beginning, what about reallocation of resources in the state sector and the government sector? How do you see that happening? Or how should it happen?
Well, what a good chunk of the Italian public administration is doing is smart working now. In many ways, you know, there are part of the, in this sense, quasi-public sector that are playing a vital role, which is, for example, the post. I mean, people are switching to e-commerce and they need people delivering goods, and the Post is doing that quite well, I think. Priorities clearly will need to be rearranged. I shall mention one thing which is proving to be more effective than any of us ever thought is Italian universities. I mean, lectures were switched to online platforms, and so far has been a relative success. Not so much actually for lower schools, because there you do have a problem, which is by and large a problem of digital divide. I mean, some families do not have a personal computer at all, or they have only one, and perhaps they have two kids. And clearly that's making their life quite difficult in as far as following lectures is concerned. When it comes to public spending as a whole, now nobody is trying to even ask the question you very perceptively asked. But to me, it's clear that in the next few years, we should be rearranging priorities. It's very likely that we will get out of this pandemic thinking that a certain level of redundancy in the healthcare sector is needed. For example, that we need to have more ICUs than we used to have. Now, if you think about these emergency intensive care, I'm sorry, I keep calling them emergency, but intensive care units in Lombardy, basically the number was yes, not yet double, but it's approaching to be twice as many after slightly more than 1 month of COVID-19. So the healthcare sector in Lombardy, from that particular perspective, so when it comes to hospital care, it worked quite well. Some of it was done in the private sector, but some of it was done by government. So in Milan, we have now a new hospital right in the center, in former Fair building, exactly like in Madrid, which is totally devoted to COVID-19 patients. What do we do with it? Once in 2 years' time, all of this is over. Well, perhaps we will need to spend more in healthcare than we used to. And to do that, we can either raise taxes, which is going to be very difficult because, of course, taxation is very high in Italy, and income is going to be smaller than it used to be before this. Or we need to reshuffle spending in the public administration. One of the problems of Italy is that Italian public spending is, lots of it is pensions. And the former government, led by the same Prime Minister, Mr. Conte, has actually put in place a device to lower, albeit not permanently, retirement age, which was a tremendous waste in a country with the sort of demography that Italy has. But also it's a problem because it's a very expensive thing. So generally speaking, my sense is that we will doubt it. We will need to accept a certain amount of redundancy in healthcare. So perhaps having more doctors than we actually need, certainly having more ICUs than we need in normal times. But this should lead to rethinking government priorities. Now, one big problem is that, with this hope that we can endebt ourselves even more, we hear lots of talks about government entering private businesses as a shareholder, for example. So spending even more. In the first package that was passed by Parliament in order to cope with the emergency, 25 billion, some of it dealt with buying more equipment for hospitals and somehow updating the hospital network, very important. Some of it was about using basically instruments to keep people receiving a salary, but $500 million was there in order to inject some money in Alitalia, the eternally bankrupt Italian airline. Of course, a very bad idea to become the shareholder of an airline, particularly now in an historical moment in which all airlines are going bankrupt. But that's what we did a few weeks ago. So you certainly understand the Dutch concerns when it comes to giving money to Italians.
Does this crisis and some of the things we've learned as a result of it mean the end of globalization? Are we looking at a situation in which we can't trust other countries to with long supply chains? We don't know that they are reliable suppliers when a crisis comes along. We have a huge percentage of our medicines manufactured in China. Are we now worried about that? Will we move to change it? What, in your view, are likely to be the long-term trade and foreign relations developments as a result of the crisis?
Well, I have no idea, honestly. It can go either way. There are actually good indications, good signals. It may go one way or another. On the one hand, we do see that yes, we are dependent on India and China for lots of manufacturing, but in the very same time, the extent by which supply chains are interconnected is far more extended than the visible side. So one of the big problems we do have these days, and I think that's going to be something European states need to tackle with quite soon, has to do with agriculture and the extent by which agriculture in Europe and within Europe is strongly interconnected, and just by raising barriers at checkpoints as we used to have is threatening and damaging for supplies of the most essential kind. And on the other hand, if we do develop a vaccine in reasonable time, or which I think is the only possible and true game changer in the short time, if some pharmaceutical treatment, which is already available, becomes is tested and so is proven as something that helps at least to avoid the development of sickness into more problematic stages, as it may be the case with a bunch of things that are around that we're talking about every day, starting with anti-malarial drugs. Well, the world will need all the manufacturing strength of China and India in order to have enough supplies to have widespread benefits. On the other hand, I think one of the biggest change in the short run is going to be travel. So if the idea is that for the next 2 years, if I need to travel to the US, I need to be quarantined for 14 days before doing whatever I need to do in New York or Chicago. Well, I'm very unlikely to travel there unless, of course, I have some very essential business to perform. And this is by itself a very strong blow for globalization and trade, generally speaking, because at the end of the day, what entrepreneurs do is developing relations. It's very important to have factories and do stuff, but at the end of the day, if you need to develop new things, if you need to find suppliers, if you need to find buyers, you need to go around and sell yourself before selling your stuff. So I think it could easily go either way. It will depend, by and large, not so much, I think, of existing political views, but it will depend on the fact that somehow keeping prosperity at the same level as it was before becomes a priority in the political agenda or not. If it does, I think we're going to be seeing some creative solutions, some important changes. One of the most relevant possible change is the fact that if you are shortening the supply chains for a lot of stuff, it means you need to encourage local production. And to encourage local production, one thing will be lowering intellectual property protection, particularly for medicine and this sort of stuff, and therefore allowing for a more widespread production. But of course, that will require government paying more for medicine in order to sustain pharmaceutical industry on the other hand, and particularly it will require European governments to stop to rely to the US to being basically the baker of all pharmaceutical innovation in the world because of a slightly more free market and patent center system. So I think if the issue becomes we need somehow to keep the same level of household welfare as we used to have, we're going to be seeing some unexpected policies.
Actually, let me ask you a narrow question of this kind, on this topic. One of the things that's happening in American politics has been the decision of Donald Trump as president to pursue bilateral trade deals wherever he can, rather than stay within a multilateral trade arrangements overseen by the WTO. Do you think that is now going to become a more popular and more general way of doing things, or will that too turn out to be limited to the years he's president?
Well, I think that if we need to try to go back to the level of household welfare we had before, the best solution would be having basically zero tariffs on whatever and on whatever goods and arrangement. It seems to me that even though the rhetoric of multilateral trade agreements is clearly weakened by basically 20 years in which it was impossible to develop a new one of those multilateral trade agreements. At the very same time, the sort of bilateral agreements President Trump has pursued were based upon the idea, we enter into an extremely rough negotiating process and we win stuff for ourselves. And now the U.S. administration is realizing, for example, it desperately needs to keep India not raising tariffs rather than raising tariffs itself. Also, we talked before about this reallocation of resources, which means at the end of the day that some businesses that used to make T-shirts will start to make face masks, for example. This makes international supply chains possibly even more complicated because if you used to do T-shirts, you are likely to rely upon your old suppliers who are going to be changing what they do as well. So any more element of rigidity, I think, particularly at this point, is a factor of risk at the end of the day. So. As I said, I think the old Georgian solution, which is zero tariffs, looks to me as one of the few strategies about which we can say it will work nicely in helping us to cope with the downside of this phenomenon.
Well, of course, that will be a hard sell at the moment in the United States. And I think this is my final question. If you stand back and look at the situation as it is today, both economically and still as we still battle the coronavirus through health systems which are coming under strain, I want to ask you this question. In relation to healthcare, which models are coming best out of this system and why?
Well, when it comes to health services, No, Italy is in a very particular position because we do have a limited degree of differentiation within the country. So the Italian healthcare system is basically a beverage model, so it's a national health service, but it is structured through regions. So Lombardy, for example, has a model in which 35% of hospitals are private. These are real hospitals, so these are not small establishments for low complexity cares. I mean, these are hospitals used to treat lots of oncological patients, lots of patients with cardiovascular disease, and now they're treating lots of patients with COVID-19. Lombardy clearly had lots of problems. These problems were basically due to the fact that we started with the first small lockdown in the south of Lombardy in correspondence of the first outbreak. That was a very successful experiment. So it clearly kept the contagion down for a while. But we did not implement second lockdown in the area of Bergamo. And the story about that is horrific. It's published yesterday and today on Corriere della Sera, Italy's The Times, basically speaking. And the story is that all different institutions somehow refused to take the decision. So the regional government was saying it should be the national government. The national government was saying it should be the regional government. The regional government was saying, well, it's up to the hospital. Everybody was trying not to take responsibility. And the result has been the worst outbreak in the country. Still, when it comes to the quasi-competition between private and public hospitals, it worked very well. Private hospitals were very good in mobilizing resources, in, for example, opening new emergency cares only for COVID-19 patients. One of the biggest COVID-19 hospitals in Milan is private. Actually, two of the biggest are private. So this model of a market competition worked decently, but on the front of public health care, of government decision in dealing with the disease, there's no question that Lombardy has been highly problematic. Veneto, which is the region of Venice next to us, has instead a very government-centered healthcare, a pure British system in many ways, extremely centralistic at the local level. I think in normal times, their performance, the performance of their hospital is worse than ours. But in this emergency, they were extremely good in putting in place a lockdown in a small town, which was the place where the first outbreak happened, Voe Euganeo, near the city of Padova. And this lockdown has been a very important experience. It's been a success in terms of treating patients, but it's also been one of the few instances in which we actually learned something about the virus. And therefore, the advisor that suggested to the local government to do this, Professor Crisanti, has contributed already a series of articles to the New York Times and The Guardian, but is also conducting studies on that experience, and I think they would be very good to increase our knowledge. So to me, the thing is, whatever the balance between government and the private sector in the healthcare system, I think it was good for Italy to have different systems within itself, so that we could have different experiences and different experiments. And one of them turned out to be a good one.
And in relation to wider political philosophies, well, I can think of several. One is a pure socialist one. Another would be a regulated and managed capitalism, with or without high tax rates. And then finally, as free market a system as you can get under classical liberal principles. Can you see which of those is likely to profit most as a result of this situation? Will it come up with the best solutions? And can you tell us if there are other, in a sense, large structures I haven't thought of that might do better?
When it comes to broader political philosophies, I do not quite know. Also because, quite frankly, contemporary politics pretends at least to be more detached from political philosophy than it used to be in the past. So we're talking on April the 9th, on April the 8th, 7 years ago, Lady Thatcher passed away. And I don't think we do have any politician in the West that is somehow an incarnation of an old vision of society to the extent Thatcher was, but to the extent that Clement Attlee was, or François Mitterrand in his own way was. The big fashion among politicians these days is to be pragmatic. There are a lot of virtues in pragmatism, but one of the problems with pragmatic politicians is that there is actually a very short step between pragmatism and claiming a blank check from the population.
I think that's a good point in which to end. Alberto, many thanks. I found what you had to say
John.
Fascinating, and look forward to talking to you again. All the best.
Thank you so much.